Chainsaw Man and Jujutsu Kaisen are two series that have a lot of overlapping ideas. They're both dark, they're both a bit weird, and they both have some cool and interesting power systems. But there's one thing Jujutsu Kaisen has that Chainsaw Man doesn't: domain expansions. Which got me thinking, what if Chainsaw Man characters did have domain expansions? And thus this video was born. I developed domains for a number of characters based off of their abilities and their personalities, and today I want to go over them. Let's get started with our main protagonist, Denji. Denji is hard to make a domain for. The inner machinations of his mind are an enigma, and I think how he thinks changes quite a bit over this series, which complicates things a bit. But if there's one thing that has remained consistent, it is his desire to live a normal life, whatever that may be. So Denji's domain is Normality, Teenaged Boy Edition. Visually, this domain is just a simple apartment like the one Denji ended up in at the end of part 1, or the Hayakawa residence, but with a few suspicious magazines strewn about. In this domain, Denji's sure hit is focused on himself, and it allows him to bypass his contract with Puchita, allowing the Chainsaw Devil to take its true form in the domain. This would give Denji a super powerful domain, and it makes sense as well. A domain is anything but normal, and that is the main condition to Denji's contract. This domain is a bit simple, but I think that's fine because Denji isn't the type of person that would have an overly complex domain. It's also a bit hard to come up with a domain effect for Denji because his ability is just so straightforward and simple. But that is highly contrasted by our next person, Makima, which are brought to you by AFK Arena. AFK Arena is a masterclass of the idle RPG game genre, and now is the perfect time to get into it because they're collaborating with the anime That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime for the month of June. Both Rimuru and Shauna will travel to the Asperia continent as void heroes to form wonderful bonds with the heroes of AFK Arena. Both are faithfully recreated in art and gameplay, with Rimuru possessing his equal naming ability and his regenerative abilities being faithfully recreated as well, allowing him to bounce back from the brink of death. Lilith Games worked with the original Japanese voice actors to provide the voices of Rimuru and Shauna. You can play a number of game modes like PvE Story, Dungeon, Kingtown, and more. With over 100 different characters, there will sure to be at least one that fits your playstyle. And there's even a brand new benefit via the 180 summon activity, which gives you welfare summoned and a guaranteed SP hero summon at least for completing specific activities. This game is seriously fun, and using the code in the comments down below, you can gain 50 extra summons. So be sure to download AFK Arena from the link in the description below. Makima is almost the opposite of Denji. She has a very obvious power that she uses and abuses, and as such, her domain is based on that. Everlasting Control is a semi-lethal domain, and it represents Makima's goal for an everlasting cold peace for humanity. As such, the domain is basically just an open snowfield with closed doors throughout, symbolizing her opponent's missed opportunities to resist. The field is also supposed to be a foil to her home in hell, the snowy fields opposing the lush green grass and the doors on the ground contrasting the doors populating the sky. As for the actual effect, this domain's sure hit puts all within it under Makima's control regardless of their strength. When this domain is active, the control cannot be broken by anyone, not even Makima, but once it closes, the strength of the control weakens to her normal strength, so opponents that are stronger than her can escape. In addition to this, Makima must kill one person in the domain before she can deactivate it. This is a condition to limit her strength, as without it she could just use her domain on strong opponents one by one and control them with no conditions. In this case, she is forced to eliminate them, which prevents her from getting them under her control. In reality, this just postpones the issue, as anyone stronger than her is probably a devil, so they will just reincarnate in a short time. Next up, we have Power and her domain, Emperor of the Pacific Ocean's Bloodbath. Because Power is the blood fiend, I decided to base this domain around, well, blood. Go figure. It's similar to Megumi's domain in Jujutsu Kaisen, but instead of flooding an area with shadows, she floods it with her own blood. This is inherently risky, and it does limit the potential size of her domain, or else she will pass out from blood loss. But once the domain is sealed, Power cannot pass out from a lack of blood because the blood pooled at the bottom can be recirculated through her body. She also gains the ability to drink her own blood to heal any injuries she sustains as well, giving her a fair bit more durability and endurance than she usually has. The sure hit of this domain is Spires of Blood that constantly erupt from the floor directly below the opponent. All her other blood-based attacks also use less blood while being more powerful, allowing her to hit harder while also being flexible and more creative with her blood use. Visually, this domain is just a bunch of red blood cells circulating the walls, and if you're curious about the name, it just feels powery. Let's finish up the main 4 of part 1 with Aki before we get into some of the primal devils. Aki's domain is Graveyard for the Fallen Family. Visually, this domain is the graveyard holding the Hayakawa family grave, but the names around the family grave have been changed to the names of other people Aki has lost. So names like Himeno, Tendo, Angel, and others would appear on the graves until the graveyard is full. The sure hit effect of this domain is inflicted on Aki, and it basically gives him a general buff in speed, perception, and healing, and the buffs get stronger the more names there are in the graveyard. The closer he is with people in the graveyard, the more of a buff he will receive as well. So people like Himeno and his family will give him a bigger boost than the people who died to Riz. He is also able to use his devil contracts with no repercussions, such as shortening his lifespan. This domain feels like a perfect fit for Aki to me. If there's one thing he cares about in this series, it's saving those he cares about. The connections he makes throughout the series stick closely to him, so I think it makes sense for him to draw power from them, especially once they've passed. Okay, let's cover the Primal Devils, but first, please consider subscribing to my second channel. That's right, I've started a second channel for live content, which also means I will be streaming more on Twitch if you're interested in that. I'd really appreciate your support on getting this second channel up and running, and maybe check out the shorts that are there as well to see if you like it. There will be a link in the comments below. The first Primal Devil I want to cover is the Darkness Devil. The Darkness Devil's domain is simple, pure emptiness. It is a pitch black domain that cannot be illuminated by anyone or anything, no matter how bright. The victims of this domain are forced to face their most primordial fear of darkness, stripping back the years of societal training against the dark. This is the sure hit, so there is no way for people in the domain to avoid facing this fear. The fear prevents healing and regeneration in stronger opponents, as well as causing hallucinations and paranoia, but for those significantly weaker than the Darkness Devil, which is like a lot of people, the sheer fear sends them into cardiac arrest, killing them within seconds. This might sound overpowered, but you have to remember, this is a Primal Devil, one of the strongest entities in Chainsaw Man that is conceptually immortal. It makes perfect sense for him to have a completely busted domain, because he is completely busted in general, just like the other Primal Devil, Falling. The Falling Devil has the domain Just Desserts. Visually, this domain is basically if MC Escher made a painting of a kitchen. It is visually nonsensical, with pieces of kitchen equipment just kind of floating around as well. However, it is missing one thing that every single kitchen has: a floor. This is important to the effect of the domain. Because there is no floor, all of the Falling Devil's opponents are constantly in a state of falling, as if they were in a never-ending skydive or something similar. But this is not the sure hit of the domain, just an environmental effect. The sure hit is essentially the move Falling used on the Justice Devil, where she enforced gravity on him to such an extent that he was basically crushed into smithereens. This same gravity will be enforced on anyone that enters the domain as well, which will just kill a lot of opponents instantly. Now, I know what you may be thinking. We see humans survive under great amounts of pressure all the time, like when they're diving underwater or when they're moving extremely fast. How will this kill them? Well, in a lot of those cases, the pressure is applied over time, which allows the human body to kind of adjust. That doesn't happen here. This is more like the weight of a boulder being forced upon someone, or the weight of your mom. It should just instantly crush them without much issue. Once again, this domain sounds overpowered, and that's because it's supposed to be. The Falling Devil is one of the strongest characters in Chainsaw Man, plus I think all the other aspects of the domain make a lot of sense. Our next character, though, is not one of the strongest characters in the series. In fact, she is among the weakest. It's everybody's favorite girl failure, Asa. Asa's domain is the Loneliest Love. Visually, it is a Japanese classroom with only one desk, and unanswered love notes strewn across the floor. Asa sits at the desk and judges all of her opponents in the domain one by one. This is the sure hit, and as such, it cannot be avoided. Asa gets to peer into her opponent's memories, gaining knowledge on their abilities and their history. If Asa decides she likes them based on their history, the domain closes and nothing happens. If she decides she loves them or wants to become friends with them, both Asa and the opponent gain a buff, healing their injuries and strengthening their attacks for the remainder of the fight. But if she hates them or even slightly dislikes them, the opponent gets a debuff. This scales with how much she dislikes them, so the more hated they are, the bigger the debuff. These debuffs can manifest in a number of forms. As I'm sure is apparent, this is a non-lethal domain, which I think makes a lot of sense for Asa, as she doesn't want to hurt people if she can help it. Yoru, on the other hand, definitely does want to hurt people, and that's exactly what she would use her domain for. I think it makes the most sense to give these two separate domains despite sharing a body, as their mental landscapes could not be more different. Yoru's domain is Weaponized Victims. In this domain, opponents of Yoru will slowly be turned into weapons via her sure hit. One limb at a time transforms before the victim fully becomes a weapon. The exact duration of this transformation changes depending on the strength of an opponent, but it can never take more than 20 minutes. If a part of the weapon the victim is turning into is usable by the victim, they can use it on Yoru, and if they are successful in landing a hit, the domain automatically collapses. However, even if the domain gets destroyed, these transformations are permanent, meaning that even if they somehow escape, they will still be partially, potentially essentially incapacitated. Visually, I think this could either be like a weapons locker or maybe a weapons museum, as those have a wide variety of weapons from a lot of different time periods, but I'm not entirely sure, so maybe let me know what you think it should be in the comments down below. Speaking of weapons, let's talk about the weapons devils. Personally, I feel like all the weapons would have the same domain, just in different fonts for each weapon, as that is essentially what they are for devils. Visually, their domains would be a dirt arena with their weapons strewn about it, kind of like Yuta's domain, but instead of having these things, it is each of the respective weapons of each devil. The sure hits for these domains would be split into two categories: the ranged attackers and the close combat ones. For the ranged attackers like Barum and Quanxi, their sure hit would be simple. All of their ranged attacks will hit 100% of the time. For the close combat ones like Katana Man and Whip, they gain a homing effect on all of their offensive ventures. There are two exceptions though: Bomb and Gun. Bomb fights with both ranged and close-up attacks, so she gets both the bonuses of the other weapons devils. This gives Rize a very strong domain, which I think makes sense, as she is by far the weapon devil that was the best at utilizing their weapons. The Gun devil, on the other hand, is kind of hard to build a domain for. See, it already has a built-in sure hit effect in its attacks, as the devil sets a condition to kill people and then executes the command with 100% perfection. So how can we improve on that in a domain? We don't. Instead, I think we would use the Gun devil's other notable characteristic, its speed. The domain I've come up with is $800 billion budget. In this domain, the Gun devil is still able to shoot its targets perfectly, but its sure hit comes in the form of its insane speed, which it uses to ram into opponents with high force and perfect accuracy. This will allow him to do massive damage to any opponents stuck in the domain and might be enough to outright kill 99% of opponents. As for the visual, I think it makes sense to draw inspiration from the world's largest gun manufacturer and distributor and user, the United States Industrial Complex. As such, the backdrop for this domain is the corners of the Pentagon just kind of floating around, while the ground is a bomb-wasted field just filled with rubble and bullet casings. This symbolizes both how guns are developed and also used by the United States, which was the biggest provider of arms even back in the 90s when Chainsaw Man is taking place. We only have 3 more domains to talk about, and the next one is Quanxi's. That's right, I want to give Quanxi 2 domains because the abilities of her human form and weapon form are just so different. Plus, her human form is so powerful on its own, so why not? Considering Quanxi is likely thousands of years old and is kind of a prodigy at combat, I think it makes sense to give her a barrierless domain. The domain is Love and Ash. This domain covers the area around Quanxi in 3 inches of cigarette ash, which acts to slow opponents trying to escape the 100-meter radius of her domain. While the domain is active, Quanxi is also hypersensitive to the movements of those within her domain if they unsettle the ash. These 2 aspects allow her to easily annihilate anyone that gets trapped in her domain, despite it not technically being lethal. The ash can also cause breathing problems for those within the domain, as it can get kicked up pretty lightly. This will also create a smoke screen out of the ash, and it is a smoke screen that only Quanxi can see clearly through. On top of this, every minute that the domain stays open, the ash refreshes, adding 3 more inches to the piles. This not only makes escape harder, it also makes fighting harder as well. Love and Ash is obviously inspired by Quanxi's habit of smoking cigarettes, as well as the way she fights, as it is kind of mysterious and smoky, if that makes any sense at all. Next, I want to talk about the 3rd sister of the apocalypse, Fami. Fami's domain expansion is Ravenous Undying Hunger. This domain takes place in a wheat field that has been ravaged by locusts and drought, causing a famine because Fami is, well, the famine devil. The effect of this domain is simple. Everyone who is in this domain experiences extreme hunger and burns 10,000 calories a minute. The human body normally only burns 2,000 calories a day, so this effectively puts her opponents in danger of starving to death if the domain battle goes on for too long. The process of burning this many calories so quickly will also weaken her opponents over time, eroding their muscles and causing general fatigue as hunger takes over. This hunger obviously has the effects that being hungry usually does, such as being more irritable and being less able to think clearly. Fami's domain also has a secondary effect of allowing Fami to turn her opponents into pawns if she wins and wants to, as one of her abilities is to turn those who are starving into effigies that she can control. Honestly, I can't think of a domain that is better for Fami. I think this really exemplifies everything we know about her and her powers. So let's finally wrap up with Nayuta, who has the domain Doggy World. Nayuta's domain is somewhat similar to Makima's, as they are the same devil, but hers is far less sinister. Inside Doggy World, everyone is forced to obey Nayuta's commands, the first of which is always to act like a dog and treat everyone except Nayuta as if they are also a dog. This first command acts as the first half of the sure hit hit of the domain. The second half is that all dogs must obey Nayuta while they are in the domain. If she tells them to roll over, they must. If she tells them to sit, they must, but her control is not just limited to dog commands. Literally any command issued by Nayuta while the domain is open must be followed. This includes if she wants her opponents to kill themselves or fight each other. But don't worry, Nayuta doesn't want her opponents to die, she just wants to heavily humiliate them and entertain herself for a bit. So while this is technically a lethal domain, she does not use it as such. This domain is mostly inspired by this interaction between Nayuta and Yoru, as well as her love for dogs in general. While it is clear that Nayuta will kill if she needs to, she definitely seems more interested in playing and entertaining herself with her power than using it for anything else. Visually, this domain would just look like a dog park. Simple but effective, and yes, this domain does work on real dogs as well. And that's all of them. Sorry if I didn't do a character that you wanted me to do. I honestly couldn't think of any domains for any other people, so I just decided to do these ones. If you enjoyed, please be sure to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week for another video.